So a little while back I made a pretty short video discussing my weird adventure into a very loosely defined category of games. But when I was talking about one in particular, I said this. I want to completely derail for a second here. I fucking love Nuclear Throne. I think it's a great game and I'm sad more people don't play it. Afterwards, a number of people, which is shockingly higher than 0 or 1, responded to this, all generally saying, "Hell yeah, dude, I love that game. Great game, woohoo, happy times all around." And honestly, with those responses, and the amount of people who told me that they played one of the games I recommended and came out the other side loving it, I'm gonna try my luck again. Here's one of my favorite games of all time that I don't believe gets enough attention in the modern day, Nuclear Throne. Nuclear Throne is a top-down shooter action roguelite that came out in 2015 and is one I wholly believe is one of the best ever made. Why? Well, sit around and watch if you want to figure it out. But either way, this is going to be a fair few minutes of me gushing about a game I love, and if you're interested in watching, I hope by making this I'm going to abduct like maybe 15 people onto my weirdly specific love for this game. Also, unlike a few games I've covered and given a similar recommendation, such as One Shot, this isn't really a story game, so you can watch this and not really spoil yourself and ruin the game. There's story elements, don't get me wrong, there's a lot you can potentially dig into, but when it comes to what you're doing, the story is essentially just get to the Nuclear Throne for the most part. Also, lastly, there'll be a sponsor at the end of this video because ding dong, hey, I don't usually do this, but the kind guys over at Gamer Supplements, I think that's what they're supposed to be abbreviated to, they decided to give me this cool boy limited time offer that is free shipping for orders over $30 for only a day with code Gunface, which is good, that's great. So we're gonna do it now. Do you like water? If you don't, your life is not long for this world. I love water, but the problem is some days my dumb monkey brain wants flavor, and water doesn't exactly taste like a gourmet treat. So I really enjoy water flavorings. I have a whole collection of them, and some of them are really great. One of those great ones is Gamer Subs. It's really, really good. Whenever I use water flavorings, it's going to typically be theirs. Also, unlike some of the competition, GS over here is keto-friendly, sugar-free, 0 calories, and you can choose between caffeine-free or organic caffeine varieties. I only drink the caffeine variant because I am a nocturnal gremlin creature, but there's merit to both. If you want flavors, the two I would recommend the most are strawberry and blueberry raz, both of which are absolutely incredible. Of course though, I do have to address the elephant in the room. Do you like anime? I'll concede it's not really my thing. There's a few of them I liked, but I'm more of a fan of the gritty, let's be stressed 24/7 shows. But if you do, and you want your parents to be very disappointed in you, we got a lot of options. Debatably way too many options. I guess you could really say they're showing off their cups, ha 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 ha. Also, I'll be honest, I just use water bottles because the scoops are actually really well sized, unlike some other brands where you're just piling it in like an excavator. But don't let that stop you from buying these because I earn a % of what you buy. Winky face. You can even buy shirts if you really want to, but please don't. Please. Yeah, so that's code Gunface for free shipping if your order is over $30. If you're watching this after this deal is over, it'll still be a 10% cut off your order, which isn't as fantastical, but is still really good. My voice is dying because I've been recording audio for way too long, so I'm going to go ahead and let my past self do the talking again. Bye-bye. So, what's the goal of Nuclear Throne? Get to the Nuclear Throne. Here's a gun, here's a character select screen, go. I'll discuss characters a bit more in depth later, but in terms of gameplay, this is very simple. You don't really have to play a whole lot of games in any of these genres to understand the gist of what you're supposed to do. Shoot the guys, collect the rads they drop, which is effectively experience, get a different or more powerful gun, level up and get a new mutation, which is this game's perks, get to the next level, shoot the guys, get a different or more powerful gun, get a new level and mutation, get to the next level. Very simple. In terms of level design though, it doesn't do the standard roguelite thing of just having a preset list of generated rooms and tossing them all together in a weird maze or grid. From what I understand, it's procedurally generated with certain enemies, attributes, and obstacles for every different level. For example, the starting area of the desert is your very standard open level with nooks and crannies for cover or for enemies to hide out in, such as bandits that shoot very inaccurate slow blasts, maggots, and maggots that only hurt you if you get near them, and the slightly more concerning scorpion that you probably shouldn't touch that shoots out a pretty nasty array of goop. And the rare variant that shoots out a lot of goop and even shoots out a wide arc of goop upon death. The next area, the sewers, is more claustrophobic with the generator preferring more claustrophobic hallways. There are some wide open rooms, but those are often sectioned off by previously mentioned halls. And the enemies here do a great job of alleviating that feeling. There are lots of rats that will run at you and do rat things in melee, alligators that have a very powerful shotgun blast, but they only really fire it if you get really close or stay still for too long, running frogs that never stop running in an attempt to kamikaze into you, and the assassin that is very quick, has erratic movement, and has a melee attack that does a massive amount of damage. Then there's the Scrapyard that is generally kind of a mix of the first two areas. Assassins make a return, and they can even play dead to get an edge on you. There are crow enemies that have more concise blasts compared to the bandits, and can fly on top of you to either punish aggressive play or to punish cautious play. You get the idea. Generally, despite the very valid concerns you may have about this style of level design, I think the amount of times I've had to restart a run because of terrible level generation is easily countable on one hand. In fact, the one and only time I've actually spawned into a level and an enemy was right on top of me, it was just a bandit. He was just sitting there like, hey dude, nice weather we're having, huh? And then I promptly shot him to death, and then I went about my day. Vaguely speaking of which, let me talk about the time to kill, because this is the one thing I think that comparatively makes this game more engaging for me. You don't really have much iframes in this game. You do, but they're extremely quick. Even on the literal first level of the game, you can easily die in as little as 2 to 3 hits depending on your character. And I really like that. You can die extremely quickly. But it balances this by giving you absurd tools at your disposal. Once you get your run going, you can just as easily retaliate and kill most of your enemies with ease. And one thing I do want to say real quick though, which is kind of a big turnoff, on Steam and on initial playthroughs I hear a lot of people compare this to a bullet hell game, however I really don't think that's the case. Don't get me wrong, there are exceptions, but generally, with the tools you have at your disposal and the random level generation, you're not really going to have those standard stand in the middle of the screen and watch the attack patterns while firing fights. And generally any rooms or places that can have bullet hell-ish moments, there are dozens of different ways you can circumvent that. And that's another thing I think that's actually very nice about this game comparatively. At the very least until the late game, you can play completely different styles and they'll all generally be worth it. I find that in a lot of cases, a very cautious playstyle where I utilize defensive tools and get from A to B, utilizing cover and certain weapons, is generally just as rewarding as going in guns blazing. At the very least for the first few loops, positioning and knowing which fights you can take and general game knowledge will get you very far. We'll talk about the absurd late game later, because I had to talk to a lot of people about that. For now though, I'm actually going to talk about those tools I keep mentioning because all these concepts very quickly interconnect with each other in a way I've seen very few roguelites accomplish. First, let's talk about the character select, because characters are massively important in this game. So I'm just going to go ahead and say something I know outright a lot of people won't agree with. When it comes to roguelites, I really like it when my characters have very unique and distinguishable playstyles, strengths and weaknesses, but not so much that it forces you to funnel into select builds. For example, let me contrast this with two very different roguelite games that I both enjoy immensely. In Taboy, when you pick a character, with a few exceptions, most of the time your playstyle is going to be entirely dependent on your run. This got better and better with Afterbirth, Afterbirth Plus, and Repentance, but generally for a lot of the characters, for the longest time, you would pick a character and the most you'd be able to look forward to is Woo. I have one more heart and a slightly better starting item. And that's why my favorite character in that game was the Lost. This ghostly fella was infamous and is still kind of infamous for dying in one hit, so it forced you to play the game with a lot more caution. When you compare that to a game like Risk of Rain 2, where every character has a fundamentally unique playstyle and abilities and items they want and items they don't want, and compared to other characters, those items may be the ones they want the most. Although you're very much playing the same game with the same pool of items, you're looking forward to very fundamentally different experiences. Like for example, I can have the same exact items as the Huntress and as the Engineer, but one of those characters is going to inherently be better than the others just by the fact that they're a different character. And where Nuclear Throne lies on this imaginary graph, I would imagine is probably more so on the higher end, but still very close to the middle. Like a 6.5 out of 10. So let me go ahead and run through all the characters and their abilities, and by the way, this is extreme summary mode, so if you've played the game, you won't get a whole lot out of this segment. The first two you start with are Fish and Crystal. Fish gets a lot more ammo, starts with more ammo, and his right click is a basic roll towards the direction of your cursor. Solid, no weaknesses, nice mobility, safe first character. Crystal starts with more HP and has a right click that temporarily deflects or negates most damage types for a few seconds. Safe, reliable, and is actually extremely good in high-end play. Eyes has increased vision in certain levels with lower vision range, such as the sewers, and he has telekinesis, which makes projectiles veer off of you just slightly, and pulls enemies and pickups towards himself. That last part may seem bad, but trust me, pulling enemies is a much better thing to have than you would probably expect. And there's just something about pulling an entire level towards you that just never gets old. Also, you can make some bosses a complete bitch. Then there's the Melting, who's this game's dedicated one-shot and you die character. You start with only 2 HP, which realistically is 1 HP, as there are very few attacks in the game that only deal 1 damage. And while they lack in health, they actually have one of the most OP right clicks in the game with a corpse explosion that you can activate at any time with no cooldown that explodes corpses. With a few upgrades, the Melting can just completely tear apart an entire level. Although that starting health downgrade is actually a bit much if you're going for the extreme late game. Plant is a bit more of your standard character. It moves slightly faster and can shoot a snare that hinders enemy movement, but it can also turn into an execute or make really fucking big. And generally it's a very good right click with a lot of fantastic usage in different scenarios. YV is a shitpost, but one that is dangerously lethal. He has an increased fire rate, and his right click allows him to shoot twice at the cost of twice the reload speed. You can also upgrade it to allow him to shoot 4 shots at the... Why is there a baby crying? There's not a baby in this house. I may very well be dying soon. Anyways, there's an upgrade that allows you to shoot 4 shots with only the 3 times reload speed, which is debatably useful. It can actually be quite a big downgrade in a lot of scenarios, but generally he's just fantastic. There's not a whole lot of scenarios in which you're going to go wrong for picking YV. But in terms of the characters, he's actually the odd one out of the group, as he, doesn't talk this game's language of trash talk, instead opting into beatboxing. He has a dedicated air horn button that does nothing but plays an air horn and shakes the screen. He has an absurd amount of money, he's really cool, and he's the only character that doesn't die. Instead, he just gets really annoyed and teleports back to his sick mansion, which has a fucking bop theme, by the way. Literally, all these songs are so good. I love all of them. But again, just to wrap this up, very lethal shitpost. Steroids has dual-wield weapons, and both weapons are fully automatic. One of the scarier characters, even if extremely simple. Robot is my personal favorite, and one I think is very friendly to newcomers. Robot inherently finds higher quality weapons, and can eat your currently equipped weapon to regenerate ammo or HP. This might not sound good, but with how often guns drop, it's actually really great just to be able to have a use for them and get some much needed ammo or health. However, the better at the game you are, the more Robot kind of just turns into a base character. Better weapon chance doesn't really matter much if you're looking for very specific weapons. And eating weapons in paper is cool for the late game because you can just have infinite ammo, but there's picks in the late game that just give you infinite ammo anyways. Despite all of his faults though, he's still my favorite character because he's just a cool beat boop robot. Chicken is a bit more bizarre, as when she dies she goes into a headless state where you can just keep killing, which would normally be pretty bad, but if you find a health kit in a 5-second window after your death, you can stay alive. It's great in the sense that it's a cheat death, but also every time it procs you lose out on 2 HP. So a mistake a lot of new players will make is just go completely balls to the wall and get to 6, 4, or maybe even 2 max HP and pretty much guarantee a lost run extremely early on. Don't get me wrong, you absolutely can be aggressive with it, but there is a difference between aggression and suicide, and if you're going for the former, don't. As for her right click, it's just a basic throw weapon ability, and since you start with a sword on this character, it's oddly comparable to Hotline Miami in a few ways. Which is neat because if you don't know, Hotline Miami 2 actually has a reference to these goons, so that's always cute to see. Rebel's passive is that she heals half of her damaged health every time you enter a portal, and you can use your own HP to spawn little goon allies that are just adorable and do a shockingly high amount of damage. It's probably my crippling addiction to necromancers and summoning builds in literally any game ever if it supports it, but I find myself committing suicide a tad bit too often with her because I'll get like 50 goons running around while I stay at 1 HP and I die to 1 stray bullet. No joke, I think I fucked up on Rebel the most out of any character and ended up just not using my right click at all because I suck at managing health. I'm sure there's totally viable ways to play her that I'm just ignoring, but the complete and utter rush of dopamine that enters my brain when I click the right click button, Rebel goes meh, 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 and there's just a fucking guy running around shooting at everything. It's too high, I can't ignore it, it's my very primal urges being manipulated against me. Horror gets an additional mutation choice and the right click is a little radiation beam that erases enemy projectiles and damages enemies. However, since this uses up rads, your experience, you're best off not using it very frequently and relying on the passive to get a really good run going first. But for consistent runs, Horror is one of the best to learn. Rogue starts off wanted by the IDPD, which is never a good sign, and we'll talk about them later, but whenever she takes damage, she damages enemies and destroys projectiles in a small area around her. And your radiation canisters, which is a massive part of leveling up, is now replaced with portal strike charges, which is your right click, which can completely decimate a map if you're using it well. If not used well, you're going to fucking die. It actually adds a lot more to the game because your typical progression is actually a lot more delayed, I guess would be the best word. Especially in the earlier areas, you're going to be a lot lower level than you would probably expect. She does start with a really good gun though, and I think the late game she's solid. Not necessarily the best, but definitely unique. I like her a lot. There's also Frog and Skeleton, both of which are just kind of weird. Skeleton is awful, you never want to play Skeleton ever in any scenario, but Frog has this really weird passive where he never stops moving. He has an immunity to toxic damage and has a gas spreading ability, which is... He's not the worst, but he's very much an obscure character you really don't see, and honestly I wouldn't doubt if people just flat out didn't know these two existed. I mean, there is also Big Dog, who, is definitely Big Dog. So all in all, I still think every character in this roster is great. And again, just to reiterate this point, I really like it when these games all have very different characters with different movesets and ways to utilize them. But one clarification I actually want to make right now is I'm not as big of a fan of it when it railroads you into a very specific playstyle. And I think Nuclear Throne struck a perfect balance because ultimately you can get to the end of the game or even loop a bunch of times without really using abilities. Anyways, let me go ahead and transition into something completely different. Unlockables. Outside of choosing your characters, you can also opt into changing your starting gun with a different one, which is neat, but really not a mandated aspect. So the way you do this is through storing golden guns. And first things first, golden guns don't really have all that much of an edge compared to regular guns. I believe the only character that outright benefits from starting with a golden gun would be Robot because he gets more nutrition from it. But even that is an incredibly slight edge, as we're going to talk about in just a second. But for example, the golden shotgun. What's the difference between a shotgun and a golden shotgun? The golden one shoots out one more pellet. What about machine guns? The golden one has slightly better accuracy. The golden crossbow has a slightly higher rate of fire, stuff like that. And the two big things to clarify here is that you're never going to start with, like, a golden super plasma cannon or a golden hyper slugger. It's going to be stuff like shotguns, or crossbows, or maybe even splinter guns or a bazooka. They're going to be very basic weapons you can find extremely early on in a run with maybe 3 exceptions. And because of that, for the most part, you're going to be replacing these weapons sooner or later. So it's a neat little aspect you can get into if you want. However, unless you're really dedicated or want Yvy's B skin, which is entirely fair enough, look at him go, you can kind of just overlook this. And to sidetrack this into a bit more about guns, for the most part with some exceptions, most of the guns you're going to be getting are great, and you'll probably very quickly develop a favorite type. And although there isn't some Borderlands-esque 200 billion guns, all of them feel unique enough that you'll probably utilize a bunch throughout your run. Especially so because this game has an ammo count, and at first, not an exceptionally high or forgiving one. If you aren't playing specific characters, using very ammo-efficient guns, or just aren't picking ammo-related mutations, it isn't uncommon to run out of ammo. But it isn't really an annoying problem. The best comparison I can draw to make a point would be Halo, where you're constantly swapping out between 2 guns. And while you're constantly swapping about, you're going to be looking for guns that complement each other, and discarding guns that may not be good at that time or will be outclassed. Or maybe just choose guns that you really like. For an example of one of my favorite gun types, I really like the crossbows and bolt weapons. They penetrate enemies, do a ton of damage, and are very fast. And as far as I'm aware, they virtually have infinite range. However, one of their main weaknesses is their pretty high reload time, which in this game is your time between shots. So dealing with a bunch of enemies is not a very good scenario to be in without specific mutations. So I'll frequently combo this with a shotgun or a machine gun, both of which should be very obvious in what role they play. Will say though, some of the shotguns are really fun to use. It has a lot of diversity with the flak cannon, the slugger, the auto shotguns, the flame shotguns, and of course all of the super weapons. I find myself using them a lot more than I would probably expect, and that goes for a lot of guns. There is a lot of variance, even if the variance isn't too impressive at first glance. And just to make it clear, although I talk about the simplicity and the lack of 200 quintillion guns, please note that the guns do get fucking insane, so a late game run isn't just going to have a shotgun and a crossbow. We're talking super plasma cannons, heavy auto crossbows, ultra shovels, and other very mean sounding weapons. They're a lot of fun to use, and just like a lot of things in this game, there are very few genuinely bad guns. Although I would say out of everything, guns are the one thing that have the most outliers. You're never going to use the disc gun. A lot of explosives are inherently very dangerous to use because they can blow you up. And something like the quadruple machine gun is just going to be a complete waste of resources most of the time, but generally, swapping between guns never feels like a chore. In fact, a lot of the time it feels like the complete contrary, forcing me to use weapons and tactics I may have not been utilizing much in that run. And of course this is going to have variables such as the character you're playing, the weapons you like to utilize, and your mutations, which we'll talk about later, but we'll talk about that later. To go back to this initial prompt and talk about unlocks you can put on or change your crown, which are very slight augments to the game. And honestly, most of them are more so on the downgrade side rather than an upgrade. Stuff like more enemies at the cost of less experience. Pickups are worth slightly more but fade much faster, more guns are found but ammo drops are disabled, more cursed weapons, stuff like that. Lastly, there are the B skins, which are optional appearances for every character that range from pretty easy to get, time consuming, and absurdly fucking hard. They're all generally nice to look at, and I'd say other than Cheese Crystal over here, they all look a bit better than their standard counterparts. Personal preference though. But in this very weird sequence of things I'm going to talk about, let's cover mutations. There's a whole lot of them, and generally I'd narrow them down to 4 categories. Survivability and resource management, general damage increases, and a few niche bonuses that don't really tie into player power. For a good example on all 4, there's Throne Butt, which depending on your character gives you a very different buff that ties directly into your abilities. Like for example, the Melting's corpse explosions now do 3 blood explosions and can chain react even faster. Or whenever Steroids fires a gun, there's a chance that a small amount of ammo is added into the other gun he's holding. Or YV goes from shooting 2 shots at double reload speed to 4 shots at triple reload speed, or I's telekinesis being even more powerful across all applications. Stuff like that. And of course there's the more standard ones, like crossbows. Yeah, make those bolts homing. Shotgun shells can bounce faster and create some really fucking funny moments, or give your melee weapons longer range. Struggling more with health maybe? Have +4 max health, or double the healing from all medkits, or have a small chance to heal every time you kill something. Or maybe if alternatively you're running low on ammo, pick up Rabbit's Paw for more drops, or Back Muscle for a higher ammo max. Then there's the less defined bonuses, such as for example, Euphoria, which makes all bullets slower. Plutonium Hunger, which is actually one of the best mutations in the game as it makes drops come to you faster and from farther away. Or Hammerhead, which allows you to push through a few walls on every level. Not all of them are strictly good or useful, but depending on your playstyle or your faults as a player, you'll probably really enjoy some over others. For example, one of my biggest issues in this game is managing ammo. So I find myself gravitating towards picks like Rabbit's Paw, or Back Muscle, or Throne Butt on a few characters, and even on occasion Lucky Shot. However, if I'm playing a character that has an easier time with ammo, I find myself more so gravitating towards damage and utility. There isn't a huge roster, but again, it makes up for it by having generally better all-around upgrades. Some are better than others, but not necessarily in an objective sense. Like for example, you're never going to have a choice between 2 mutations where it's +2 health or +3 health. For the most part, they want the quality over quantity route, as there are very few that come to mind that are genuinely not good. However, one set that we didn't talk about is the Ultra Mutations. If you get level 10, you can unlock one, which are all just absolutely insane character-specific buffs. Why shouldn't Melting just automatically blow up and have an execute range? Why shouldn't YV just have double rate of fire? Why shouldn't Plant's right-click have 6 times radius? Why shouldn't Fish just be able to shoot for 7 seconds straight without consuming ammo? Why shouldn't Horror just end levels early? Stuff like that. And I'll say, again, on average, every mutation is good enough that I'll actually stick with a really awful run, because even if my mutations aren't that great, I feel like at any given moment I'm only 1 or 2 good weapons or decent mutation away from turning it around. And with this gameplay style, you don't really fall into the usual trap of just being in a virtually unwinnable stat check unlike other roguelites. And please don't get me wrong, I know that if you're really good at the game, that can be the case for any game. But it's no secret with just how much you can make your character OP in games such as Binding of Isaac, Risk of Rain 2, or Slave Aspire. The difference between a really good run and a meh run is just completely night and day. And I know that extreme variation is something a lot of players enjoy. And again, don't get me wrong, when I get a God run with Dr. Fetus, Pyromaniac, Brimstone, 2020, and Monstro's Lung, very few things in gaming compare to wiping out a boss you previously died on multiple times over in one fucking hit. But at least as a player, I enjoy this level of consistency, and really I think that's why I loved the Lost in that game so much, is because it made the second-by-second gameplay a lot more engaging, because death really is just a blink away. So with everything at your disposal, let's go ahead and get more into the exploration, bosses, and your typical playthrough. So Nuclear Throne, in your typical progression, there's 7 different areas. And each level goes from 3 levels to 1 level to 3 levels to 1 level and so on and so forth. And there are secret levels such as the Oasis, Wyvie's Mansion, the Jungle, or the very elusive IDPD headquarters, but generally, you aren't going to go through these in your standard playthrough. The cool thing is all these areas promote a very different playstyle and at first glance may seem very samey, but areas such as the desert, the scrapyard, or the frozen city are entirely different in gameplay. For example, in the desert, I prefer to be out in the open with as much line of sight as possible because the projectiles are generally very slow, and the enemies usually die in a few hits, so with very basic maneuvering, I can get through all of it extremely quickly with no damage taken. But Scrapyard, on the other hand, I find myself utilizing walls and terrain a lot more. But there is still viability in running out there guns blazing. The best example of enemy design in this game is this sniper enemy. In a nutshell, this guy can and will take aim at you if he has line of sight. However, the time between that initial aim and the bullet actually firing is pretty vast, and it perfectly telegraphs where the sniper is. So this gives you a few options. Either you can continue fighting and use the telegraph to move out of the way since the firing pattern has very blatant gaps you can move to, or you can fire at it from far away if you have a decent long-range weapon. I mean, with the telegraph you're always going to know where it is, and obviously if it's firing at you, there's a clear shot to take. And since this enemy explodes upon death, you can very easily take out a small pack of enemies if they're all circling around one sniper. And if you're utilizing a run that utilizes melee weapons, you can actually deflect the bullets if your timing is good enough, and you can actually kill the sniper with his own bullets, and you don't have to worry about closing that gap or worrying about the explosion. And another great thing to utilize is since the bullets don't go through walls, you can obviously just stand behind a wall before it fires, and you're entirely safe. And since the time between shots is pretty notable, you have more than enough time to run to wall to wall to wall to reposition or get a good shot in. And I know I went into as much depth with this one extremely basic enemy as a Dark Souls boss, but hopefully this gives a concise explanation of that second-to-second gameplay. And again, this isn't a rag on other roguelites, please note that I've been playing an unhealthy amount of Binding of Isaac as well, but for comparison, that game does have some very wacky floors where the enemies can kind of just do whatever. Early on, it's pretty decently balanced, but by the time you get late into the alternate path, or really far into the late floors, you have to keep track of so many enemies and so many enemy champion variants that the flow can kind of be lost. Especially when you get into a bigger room or they start throwing in traps into the mix, everything is kind of just unaccountable chaos. I know I just have to get good or whatever, but there are rooms where the counterplay to that room was less so, oh, I should have avoided this and utilized that. It was more so, if I didn't get this fucking room at all, maybe I could have won. Nuclear Throne, on the other hand, has very deliberate and intentional design with its enemies, and I really enjoy every one. There's like 2 to 4 enemies that make me go, oh fuck, this is an annoyance, but even those are both usually very easy to deal with, and when compared to Isaac's 10 trillion, I feel like that's a pretty good number. Anyways, back on topic, on Frozen City, I find myself utilizing cover a lot more as there's a bunch of extremely narrow hallways that are generated, and when you have a bunch of melee enemies, as well as enemies that can potentially flood that hallway with bullets, yeah, you're probably going to be bonked if you're not ready for an enemy to show up at the end that can immediately charge or fire at you. You don't have to be on edge necessarily, but you do have to be aware and at the ready. So in terms of levels, everyone you're going through has very different yet equally rewarding and potentially punishing ways to play, and it makes the general progression feel very nice. Do you know what makes that progression even cooler? Bosses. So if you remember that 3-1-3-1-3-1-3 pattern I mentioned earlier, during your first run every area with 3 levels is going to have a boss. Big Bandit is the first one and he's generally very easy. You may die to him once or twice or 3 times, but his attack patterns are very easy and abusable once you have a grasp on the game, so you really shouldn't have an issue with him for too long. Big Dog is a bit more difficult because he's immensely tankier and has a circle move he spams that covers the arena in bullets, and there are missiles that can one-shot you, but just like Big Bandit, after a few attempts you should be able to very easily kill him with very little stress. God damn it. Again, his attack patterns are pretty easy to abuse, and once you know what you're doing, it's easy street. However, once you get to the Frozen City, that's where Lil Hunter lays, and he is the noob roadblock of this game. You are probably going to die on him a lot, unless you're playing as a bursty character, but even then he can very easily one-shot you if you don't know what you're doing. His moveset is very erratic, he has very scary burst, he flies up and lands down constantly, which not only deals damage but makes positioning against him very difficult. It's not like Big Bandit or Big Dog where you can kind of just generally keep them in one place and burst them down with no retaliation. He's going to call in a ton of IDPD, which will shoot guns and make your life very hellish, and although his health is comparatively low, he's still tanky enough that he's going to take a bit of punishment before dying. So yeah, with all this combined, when you're starting out most runs are going to die at Lil Hunter. However, that obviously doesn't mean he's without weakness, and with enough experience you can very easily kill him. Like, for example, if you're a character who has extremely reliable burst damage, such as YV or steroids, there are setups where you can literally one-shot the boss and bypass any of the annoyances, and generally you can actually bait out the jumps that may make your life extremely difficult, and you can put him in an extremely unfavorable position in much the same way he can jump to put you in that same position. The main thing to keep in mind is that he is extremely aggressive. You're not going to be able to turtle against him, especially if you haven't killed any of the enemies on the floor yet. You are going to fucking die if you try that. However, if you can find ways to turn that aggression against him, you'll be very well off. Afterwards, there's the entire palace where you can get to the nuclear throne. And minor spoilers for anyone who hasn't played the game yet. Actually, this warning is entirely worthless as I've been showing off throne footage the entire video, but there's one moment in particular that this game has as a rite of passage. Almost every player has to go through this at least once before laughing about it and seeing other people go through that same process and either offering consolation or mockery. Getting to the throne. Let me just play this out as a new player perspective. Yeah, this is fuckery. But really, if this doesn't light a fire under your ass to beat the game and topple the challenge, I don't know what will. The Nuclear Throne as a boss fight is unique in the fact that you can actually beat it in 2 very different ways. The first way is your more standard boss battle where you just fire at it repeatedly non-stop. It has 1500 health, so it will take an immense amount of heat before dying, but if you manage to defeat it, you get to sit on your coveted Nuclear Throne, beat the game, and watch the credits roll. However, there is an epilogue here with the IDPD, who I should probably elaborate is the interdimensional police department, who have a whole bunch of different soldiers who can and will fuck you up. Go, huh, this guy. What a dork. And you may think this could be a teaser for a sequel or a new game or a DLC, but no. What you actually have to do is go back to the Nuclear Throne and kill these 4 generators before killing the boss. Which obviously means more time taking attacks and firing, which makes this a lot harder, and ammo is a little bit more of a concern. And luckily it does spawn during the fight, so there isn't a soft lock scenario where you just have to die. but all the generators have a pretty beefy amount of health, and you need to avoid attacks the entire time. And if you try to run too far back, you may not be able to shoot the generators anymore, and ads will spawn, so generally this makes the fight a lot harder to do. But if you destroy all the generators, then kill the nuclear throne, you are then plopped back to the character selection screen where a bunch of IDPD will try to kill you. Then once you kill them, you have to fight Throne 2, who has a lot more damage and a lot more attacks. They have a full range of motion throughout the entire map, circling you at all times. You can take melee damage pretty easily, and generally despite their lower health bar, is much more fuck you. Also, I didn't mention it, but it plays the game's title screen music while fighting it, which is just nice. It's an extremely specific trope, but it's one that I love seeing in games, even if some may view it as lazy. And while we're on the subject, I won't get massively in-depth with the music, but to directly quote myself from the RPG Maker video, when it comes to video game OSTs, you either fall into the apathy zone of my brain to be forever remembered as, yeah, that soundtrack was decent, or alternatively, you enter into the Hall of Greats, where I feel like I could put on your music while I'm on a drive, working, slot it into a video, or generally just listen to it when I'm not playing the game. This is definitely a Hall of Greats soundtrack. Kings and Queens of Wasteland, the Technomancer, and the main title theme are my 3 personal favorites, but Kings and Queens of Wasteland definitely takes the cake. It's genuinely just a great song, I love it. Anyways, back to the throne. A lot of ammo drops during this fight, so you probably won't be soft-locked. But if you manage to beat him, you can then loop back to the desert and begin the looping process, which makes the game entirely horseshit. Not necessarily in a bad way, mind you, but first, to go back to that ammo part I mentioned earlier, honestly there's a lot of really small things that this game does that I start to pick up subconsciously that's genuinely just really great game design. I'm not typically somebody who gets really deep into the philosophical shenaniganizing of the video game industry, but I like to say that I know myself well enough that I'm aware of it, I guess. This is also entirely off script, but with how prevalent nowadays that over-glorified dopamine senders that, lure you into spending hundreds upon hundreds of dollars are, being self-aware enough to ask yourself, when me click thing, brain feel good. Why is it that when I click thing, brain feel good, and is it intentional? And it's kind of impossible to say whether or not it is intentional if the developer of that game isn't extremely active on social media, or has a podcast, or generally just talks about their game development, but it's pretty safe to say, when you're playing a really good game and you start to subconsciously link concepts, even if the development of that link may not have been intentional, its continued existence, if it feels good, probably is. One really great example of this is the portal that spawns whenever you beat a level. When you kill every enemy on the map, you don't just move on to the next level with the press of a button or have an item you can interact with that transports you to the next floor. A portal will suddenly burst open that can and will suck you in if you get too close. And if you get sucked in, you're going to the next level. There's no backtracking. So obviously there are many reasons as to why this may be undesirable. For example, if you didn't pick up all the valuable ammunition, radiation, or guns, unless they're right by the portal, in which case luckily they do come with you, they're staying there. You're not backtracking to get them. You're gone. And since the portal doesn't have a specific location it bursts in or have a wind-up, it can potentially block any attempt at trying to backtrack if you're in an inconvenient location. And since it interacts with the environment if a portal spawns near you, and say, for example, a car or an exploding barrel is also near you, it can blow that up and, subsequently, you. What this does is after a few deaths or incidents, you begin to start avoiding that scenario happening again. And because of it, it unintentionally wires your brain to keep track of how many enemies are left on the floor, or to map out where any may be if you didn't go down a certain path, and lets you make more on-the-fly decision-making in regards to your route of bloodshed. Another similar thing that happens is with the radiation canisters. If you don't collect a radiation canister on a level, there'll actually be a large one on the next, which is a really forgiving mechanic that helps with mistakes and makes you go, oh yeah, didn't collect it last level, my bad. But if you don't collect that radiation canister for whatever reason, on the next level, a horror will spawn. That's how you get the character, but obviously once you have the character, it's just an extremely dangerous enemy that may very well lose you the run if you weren't prepared. So if you don't want a giant radiation puppy absolutely massacring you, collect the rad canisters. Here's a reminder in case you forgot, you idiot. And to tie this into the first point, if your reason for missing a radiation canister was because a portal sucked you in, hey, there's a reminder to do that too. Pretty cool stuff. But on this note, a lot of game decisions in Nuclear Throne tend to promote very spontaneous decision making that forces you to adapt to situations on the fly. But simultaneously, since death is so close at nearly all times, you also need to be extremely cautious. However, you're also extremely overpowered compared to everything else, so with enough time and effort, you can actually abuse a bunch of mechanics to make your life extremely easy. The balance between how absurdly broken you can be with proper utilization of the things at your disposal, how the enemies interact with you both in attacks and in behavior and in the environment they're in, and how pathetically fragile you are is honestly near perfect. The Mutations are an extremely fitting name and aesthetic because despite how much danger there is lurking in every corner, you can adapt and evolve to even the odds or maybe even surpass them. If you aren't willing to evolve and adapt, you are going to be swept away, and honestly I think it's an incredible feeling that very few games can replicate. And with this being a roguelite, permadeath is going to be your teacher. And we aren't talking Mrs. Funston's spring field trip where we go to the fucking zoo, we're talking 11th grade advanced science teacher who's like a mid-50s balding man who recently got divorced and is only at the job to survive and forget about the pain. You can lose a run in the literal blink of an eye, but every death makes you that much better, much more aware, what to avoid in the future, how to best go about it, etc. So for example, the mechanic I want to hone in on to illustrate a point is /R the melee weapons. Melee may not seem too impactful at first glance because obviously this is a game where you shoot guns, so if you have to get up close and personal, you're kind of already at a disadvantage, at least in principle. However, the more you play the game, the more you kind of realize it is extremely impactful and borderline becomes required at a certain point. This is because of its decent damage, zoning capabilities, ability to swing pretty fucking fast, it usually doesn't require ammo, and by far most importantly, it has the ability to remove or deflect bullets that are firing at you. This entirely changes the meta of the game, and you might not think that at first. In fact, it's really not a stretch to say that a lot of players might think that it completely sucks for their first few hours. And that's because the enemies have a lot of interactions with melee. Big Bandit is a great first example. For the most part in the desert, you can kind of just whack enemies through walls and go, haha, look at me, I'm so good. But if you try to do it against him and think you completely outsmarted the game, think again, fuckaroo, you're dead. And then of course there's all the melee enemies that can potentially take a hit and may even be able to beat you in your standard one-on-one encounter if you're not playing it well. There's obviously contact damage, and some enemies do an absolutely absurd amount of contact damage. And then there's explosions. There are a lot of enemies and set pieces that explode upon death. So if you're just running through a level and whacking the air constantly and step too close to one, your run can very quickly end. And explosions are prevalent. Every level in the game, excluding the Crystal Caves, has at least one thing unique to them that can explode. And the Crystal Caves aren't a fun outlier, it's debatably the hardest level in the game if you're going exclusively melee. The Crystal Spiders and Crystals are both particularly unfriendly as you are entirely unable to deflect the Crystal's main attacks. The spiders will run into you, so you have to time and aim your melee attacks pretty well if you don't have specific mutations or weapon. And the crystals do a metric fuck ton of contact damage. In fact, if you loop and get to the Hyper Crystal, it does an extremely casual 200 damage, which is 10 times more than the possible max health you can have in the game, and is more realistically about over 16 times your max health. So yeah, no, you're not going to survive that. Also, fun lore tidbit I guess, the reason it does so much contact damage is, quote, whatever part of your body touches it is instantly stretched almost infinitely into the next dimension. Also, the entire boss is just kind of like really fucked and really cool, especially the cursed version. Oh yeah, the cursed crystal caves. Do you like it when that can teleport? Haha. Yeah, no. So with that and the swing speed and the multitude of enemies that can fuck you over, if you don't have long arms, a really good melee weapon, and trigger fingers, you actually have to be pretty methodical with your melee weapons and figure out when to use them and how to properly use them, because if you're just going in to whack for whacking's sake, you're going to leave yourself very, very open to death. And speaking of which, that's another thing the player has to learn. What attacks you can deflect and what attacks you can't. Because if you try to deflect a fucking laser or a plasma cannon, you're probably just going to die. But alternatively, there are a lot of attacks that you can just entirely mitigate. For example, on the throne, you can get rid of this giant attack right here, and get essentially an infinite amount of free ammo and health as long as you're paying attention. Melee weapons are a great example in a nutshell of that adapt and overcome philosophy. The more you use it and the more times you go, yep, that doesn't work, the more effective it becomes. There's a reason every late game meta run relies on the Ultra Shovel, and why there's an entire category dedicated to using exclusively ranged weapons. Once you know how to properly utilize it, it is insanely good. But speaking of which actually, there is one pretty big exception to all this really cool game design I've been talking about, and if you're somebody who isn't just really good, but an exceptionally great player of this game, you're probably going to call out one thing in particular. Looping. Looping is kind of bullshit. Enemies are usually an elite or boss variant, there's more enemies and that number will only increase with every loop. Enemies from very late in the game will spawn even at the earliest levels, and the IDPD will launch full-scale assaults on you to make you their bitch. And some of these guys are just insane, and can very easily one-shot you. And they don't just fire scary guns, they have a lot of the things you do. They have teleportation, they have shielding, they have telekinesis, they have melee, they have plasma cannons, they have... I mean, what don't they have? I mean, by the time you start fighting IDPD freaks, oh my god, there is so many of them. But fortunately, around the time you start your first loop, a few levels in is when you get those previously mentioned overpowered ultra mutations, so yeah, go ballistic. Just make sure your antics have a threshold. But also, another really cool element is now all those previously mentioned singular levels without bosses, namely the sewers, crystal caves, and labs, all now have very scary bosses that are insanely strong. They're very tanky, spawn a ton of ads, can easily one-shot you, and are generally very brutal. However, outside of all of this, there is one fight in particular that stands out, and for that you have to head to the IDPD headquarters. Not only do you have to loop, but during that loop you have to go up to an IDPD van while it's unloading units, press E, which is easier said than done as this can and probably will one-shot you if you don't go about it cautiously due to its extremely high contact damage, and then you can try and brave the IDPD, which are numerous and extremely powerful, and if you get through all 3 levels you can fight the captain, who is just insanity. Take all the elements from the IDPD that make them annoying, such as constant teleportation, dangerous bursts, powerful melee attacks and charges, as well as some other nonsense, and then combine them all together and you will suffer on this fight a lot. But if you manage to kill her, that completely ends the run. The death screen that usually says the struggle continues is finally replaced with the struggle is over upon her death. I can't stress enough, it's really fucking hard. But, do it as Rogue, and you get a cool outfit. Pretty neato. But if you don't want to end the game, you can continue the looping process forever. Well, there's probably a breaking point, I mean, look at this, but I can't confirm where this was said, but I think the general verdict the community shares is that anything above loop 2, 3, or 4 is generally not playtested. But of course the developers decided to make it infinite, as they kind of knew players were going to do their thing. They're going to dissect it inside and out to find out the best optimization possible to get as far as possible, and yeah, sure enough, it's full of shenanigans. I like to consider myself decent-ish at this game. I at the very least hit the throne and loop consistently, and I can do it on all the characters, and I think in a hypothetical there's just a standard character, like no right click, no bonuses or anything, I think I could still probably beat the throne as them. I mean shit, give me enough time and I might be able to do it without mutations either. However, in terms of getting really far in loops, I just haven't. On a decent day, I can get really far into 2, and maybe even start 3, but some players out there have gotten all the way to loop 20, which is... Do you want to see what loop 19 looks like?
You mean you haven't been wanking to the Nuclear Throne gameplay for the past few hours?
I could never fucking do this. I'm sorry, but this is too much. No. Out. So to talk about this with even the slightest amount of confidence and not just spew things like it's coming out of my ass, I decided to do a bunch of research on a bunch of stuff. There's a lot of resources, and I even directly asked the current world record holder, Master Sparky, and said, hey, help me please, I'm desperate, please, it's too much. Obviously you can go ahead and check him out, or anything I'm going to mention, I'm going to leave a bunch of links in the description, but here's a few questions I had for a general player standpoint. Firstly, most characters are playable. That turns into every character if you're just going for the first few loops, but generally, the worst of the characters for deep looping are steroids because the meta setup for it is the Ultra Shovel, which is the best melee weapon in the game, as I already mentioned. But in steroids' case, in order to utilize the Ultra Shovel at all, you need to waste one of your very valuable mutation slots on Eagle Eyes. Which technically isn't the worst mutation, but if you have to play a character fully knowing that you have to waste one of your extremely valuable mutation slots, it's not really a great character. And surprisingly, melting is also pretty bad because having lower HP is really, really punishing because at this late in the game, you're pretty much always going to take damage no matter how great you play near the end. And Skeleton because Skeleton. Characters such as Eyes, Crystal, and Chicken are all really great because of their inherently defensive abilities, but for more offensive abilities, YV and Eyes are really great. And honestly, a lot of other characters are really good, such as Plant, Fish, Horror, Rebel, and Rogue. And they all bring unique aspects to the table that can very easily have better usage than other characters, but generally, these 4 are the best. And the difficulty, despite looking like this, is actually still pretty balanced and fun, even if it goes full slideshow mode eventually. The most bullshit thing of this game is supposedly chained explosions, specifically by the IDPD freaks where, upon death, they have a chance to drop grenades and if enough drop, yeah, you're probably just dead. In terms of areas, Throne 2 tends to just fill the screen with bullshit after it scales enough, and it's ridiculously hard, and this is their difficulty ranking of all the levels. Meta mutations do tend to be required after a point. I'll display their tier list on screen now, and generally, if you're given a list of mutations that are C or lower during a run, you're probably just going to have to reset. However, this obviously doesn't mean they're all bad in a standard playthrough. Like, for example, homing bolts is actually a really well-loved upgrade, and even in higher-end play, it's utilized fairly consistently, but in a run where you're utilizing a weapon loadout consisting of an energy weapon and a melee weapon, you're not exactly going to be like, oh, shotgun shells bounce further? My favorite. And there are a few other upgrades that become redundant because of that setup. A lot of ammo-related mutations also aren't taken for that reason, as generally there are so many enemies in every level that even if a small fraction of them are dropping ammo, you're getting ammo. And really, there's a bunch of other things I could add here. I've been doing a ton of research. I have a dedicated folder to a bunch of forum pages and streams and channels, but really, it's irrelevant other than a few pretty neat-ish tidbits that I'm pretty sure only I care about. And really, since I'm kind of just regurgitating information that I found, I may say something that players will either disagree with, or may just flat out be wrong, so I'll take my leave while I still can. But, if you're the more competitive type, there's daily and weekly runs that you can attempt, well, once a day and once a week. And if you really like the concept of getting really good at a game to get high up on a leaderboard, you can do just that. And although they're not as active as some of the roguelites, there's no hacking or cheating or exploiting involved, so the leaderboard is actually pretty intense, and there's enough challenge there that securing a top 10 slot can be pretty tricky. I mean, hell, honestly, securing a top 100 is pretty tricky in of itself. Also, thronebutt.com, which, by the way, is an actual website, is pretty cool. So feel free to check that out if that's something that interests you. And I know at this point I'm basically a sales pitch guy, but like... Well, firstly, that is my intention, please play this game, but secondly, all this is pretty cool, but can you play it with friends? For the longest time, sort of. Like, it had couch co-op, but it's annoying to set up even with Steam's new local multiplayer, and honestly, sharing one screen in a game with so much going on is kind of fucking annoying. However, if you install the Nuclear Throne Together mod, it's a perfect online experience, and my god. There are very few games where I can have just as much fun as this one, and thrive in the shitty chaos, and have a virtually 0% chance of people getting upset. I'm not somebody who gets upset at video games. I have like one heated gamer moment a year, give or take, but it's no secret when you boot up a competitive game with friends, the overall mood can get pretty dull or salty. That doesn't really happen with this. Even when your friend decides today is just not going to be your day and picks Robot and eats all of your weapons, or picks Frog and Rogue to send you to the fucking Shadow Realm, it's just dumb fun and I enjoy it immensely. It feels borderline safe in a way. I don't have to deal with people flaming me for dying once, I don't have to deal with some guy picking Nunu with Ghost and Clarity, running it down mid, making the game virtually impossible. I don't have to deal with people belittling me because I just rather conveniently failed a coin toss 20 times in a row, true story by the way, and Techies isn't even in this game so I don't have to worry about them. It's just fun. And I can guarantee even when I'm starving to death and the world is under fire from a nuclear Armageddon, if I boot up this game and my friends are on board, I'm going to have fun. I would highly recommend, if nothing else, if you have the game, buy it after this video, or generally just haven't delved into Nuclear Throne Together, install it. It's an extremely easy installation. You click one exe, you press one number, you boot it up, and you invite friends through Steam. And afterwards, if you have any friends with the game, interrogate them. If they say no, or unfriend you for being, quote, too clingy, they weren't your real friends anyways. If you have friends with any amount of disposable income, interrogate them. If you have friends that say they're barely scraping by, just tell them that eating food is so 2021 and it's just really not a healthy trend right now. If you run out of friends after this, don't commit suicide and don't weep, for you never truly had friends anyways, but that's okay. I'll be your friend. Yes, you and me. Let's establish a parasocial bond. I am your new friend, and your only friend. Play Nuclear Throne with me. Or alternatively, if you don't feel like losing your entire friend group, you can just join a community where games are played. There's a few really good ones. I'm not going to brigade them, so you can find them on your own. Or don't. Just don't be annoying. Please. To segue this into another last point, there'll probably be points after this, mods. There's a lot of them. And unsurprisingly, a lot of really good ones. A few favorites of mine include the 10 times mutations mod, which multiplies mutations by 10 times and turns the entire game into this. Or this. Then there's the Nuclear Throne Ultra mod, which vastly raises the entire power level of the game and adds some really cool new stuff. At least for me, there were a few misses. Like really, I think some characters are just way too absurdly overpowered, but it's so much of a net gain and has so much great about it that those few faults don't bother me. And it really recently just got its last update, so it's kind of hard to say goodbye, but thank you for all the work you've done. Assuming you're the one watching this, you're probably not. Statistically, the chance of you being the one who made this is very low, and if you're going to take the credit, you better be the one who made it. I don't know if you're the one who made it, I can't know if you're the one who made it, I don't know who you are, and I can't know who you are. And that's the beauty of the internet. There's also Nuclear Throne Territorial Expanse, which is one I've heard many great things about, although I haven't played it. I don't know if this qualifies as a mod, but there's also all skills and grill skills, which entirely gets rid of the RNG of picking mutations, which is great for high-end gameplay, and I'm pretty sure it's going to become a legitimate way to play soon enough, so there's not as much grinding to set up a game, and lastly, I believe all these mods have support with Nuclear Throne together, although I wouldn't be able to tell you for certain. It takes a little bit of setup, but it's no Dawn of War Ultimate Apocalypse. So if you want to play some mods with your friends, go nuts. So, yeah, that's Nuclear Throne. I guess I don't have a last point after the last point. Anyways, let me summarize. I love roguelites and roguelikes. They're pretty much the takeout food of video games for me. Some days I just really don't want to go out of my way and try something I may not enjoy. Some days I don't really want to put in the effort into playing a game that I know can be extremely stressful. It's fun, and I love it. It's not really life-changing or deeply engaging from a story perspective, but I don't think it has to be, or even should be. In terms of all the roguelites I've played, Nuclear Throne is up there in my all-time favorites because I believe it's the most solid and fluid from a structural sense. There isn't really a weak area here. It may be debatably short, and the replay value may also debatably be lacking because there's not a whole lot of unlocks, but both of these can be pros in their own way. I mentioned consistency a lot in this video, and that's because this is one of the most consistently fun games for me to play. Even if I don't play it for months at a time, I can always come back rusty as ever and probably kill the throne, die to a stray bullet in the first 2 loops, laugh it off, and come back again better and brighter. I think its gameplay is some of the best in the genre, and it's not a genre that is lacking in that department either. It's not an established universe full of lore, but it's definitely one with a lot of charm, and a lot of unique little things to look at. The world, despite not being all too fleshed out, is really fun to explore and navigate. The character designs are pretty simple but appealing, the music is full of bops, and the premise is just really cool. It's $12 on Steam, and it's on Game Pass, and if nothing else, I'd highly recommend you check it out for a few runs, and if you don't like it, you don't like it. What you see is what you get, and although you will probably suck and die, if you decide to stick with it, it has an extremely fun gameplay loop and skill growth to it. I mean, hell, I can watch my earliest clips when I started making this video and cringe at all the dumb mistakes I make. I mean, I do that with my most recent clips. Like I said, I'm not that great. I like it. This game gets a Davey seal of approval. I don't do numerical scores, so I'm gonna hope my outro conveys my thoughts on a number. I don't know. I already did the sponsored segment, so that isn't going to be here, but again, use code Gunface to get free shipping, or alternatively, if you're watching this later, 10% off. Thank you to my patrons, whose names I'm going to announce out loud for that extra parasocial spice. Thank you Catapult Man 1, Chair, Judge and Jury, Wub Kitten, Skarner Crystalline, Teddy Bear Guy, Cray, Minister of Sauces, Mr. Bones, Naho Yuzu, Pyro Musical, No Goat, Plays Heart, and Angus JS for supporting the channel. Your contributions mean a lot and really help. And if you're somebody who likes to have their name read in an extremely monotone voice, monthly terrible MS Paint drawings, in plural by the way, exclusive bug videos and video updates whenever I decide to make videos, that should be happening a lot more now, feel free to join the club. It's a pretty cool one, and one I'm actually planning on adding to very soon. You also can't call me a sellout because this entire video I've been hyping up a game that I won't even earn a cent from. That's authenticity right there. Anyways, yeah. That's the outro. Bye-bye.